my screen share. All right. And get that going. Come on, baby. There we go. From beginning. All right. So I like to title my talk as Demystifying Orchid Growing, because there's so much mystique and there's so much misinformation. I, of course, am on social media. So yeah, I hang out in, I don't know how many groups on orchid growing. And oh my God, the stuff that gets thrown out there, it's scary. So where do you get good information? Come on, there we go. All right, so let's start out. Where do we usually buy orchids? I don't know about you, but I walk into my local grocery store and those people are smart. You know where they put the orchids. They're right there. You're headed for the produce. You're going to be good. You're going to get your salad. You're going to get your whatevers. And there are all these orchids. Don't be alarmed if I lose screen. It's old camera. So you're not going to look at me. You're going to look at a photo of me. So frequently, it is an impulse buy, and that's my point. One of the things that you have to think about when you buy an orchid, that impulse buy, right? Or I'm close enough to Merrifield Gardens that I can go over there and see what they've got. And let me tell you, I do. All right. So you have to figure out, what do you want? Do you want just a table decoration? Do you want a spiritual pick-me-up? And in these days, we need spiritual pick-me-ups. Or are you looking for a long-term houseplant? Because you're going to look at your orchid differently depending on what your expectations are. And I would say that the biggest question that I get is, are they difficult to grow? And I go, nah, they're easy. And how do I get my orchid to rebloom? So everybody would like this continuance, or at least most people who decide to grow it on are attracted to this continuance. Now, this talk, I'm going to talk mostly about that beauty that's on your screen right now. That is a phalaenopsis, or a moth orchid. And my cultural instructions are going to focus on phalaenopsis. If we've got time, I'll talk about some other different genera. Things that you need to know: orchids are the largest family in the plant kingdom, with somewhere around 25 to 30,000 species, depending on the taxonomist that you follow. And the hybrids number in the thousands. So there's a lot of them out there. The point of that is that you can't generalize. So I'm going to be talking about moth orchids. I'm specifically going to be talking about moth orchid culture in the mid-Atlantic states, because if you're tuning in from some other part of the country, it may be a little bit different for you. And I'm talking about windowsill culture, although I will digress occasionally and talk about artificial lights, maybe, if I feel like I've got time to do it. So how do I get my orchid to rebloom? All right. And then which orchid do I try? So as I have qualified earlier, there's a lot of different orchids out there. You're going to want to look at your environment before you start choosing your orchids, because we can break down, I like to talk about the main genera, all right? And oh, I'm sorry if that's a big word for you, but all right, we've got Phalaenopsis, we've got Dendrobium. And in this picture, let me see if I can get a pointer up. I can get a pointer. Laser pointer. Oh, look, laser pointer. I love it. The magic. All right. These are all Phalaenopsis, but this guy over here, this guy over here is a Dendrobium. Actually, I think it's a ZZ plant, but let's say it is a Dendrobium for the sake of argument. It's a ZZ, but we'll pretend. This window, therefore, has to accommodate this pretend Dendrobium. All right. Two different types of orchids that are going to have different cultural needs. So that's why I qualify by saying we're talking about Phalaenopsis pretty much throughout, so that we don't get confused. All right. So I like to break it down into three critical factors, or three most important factors for growing a Phalaenopsis, even though that is a Cattleya picture. That's one of my babies. So the first thing we're going to talk about is light. And then we're going to talk about light. And then we're going to talk about light some more. You get the picture? It's an important thing. Then we're going to talk about proper watering. Then we're going to end up talking about repotting. Yeah, that's a critical factor. So, as you probably know, if you think about it, all living organisms need energy in order to maintain life. You and I, we eat that nice salad we had for lunch, okay? But for plants, sunlight is the energy source that they use, all right? And this, by the way, is a very well-grown cattleya, and this belongs to a client of mine, and she grows that in that sunny window that you'll see a few more pictures of. So just so you know, or you can see affirmation that you can grow different kinds of orchids on the windowsill. All right, and that's a very beautifully grown orchid. She bloomed that several years. Okay, so through the process of photosynthesis, here's the scientist in me talking. That's how plants convert sunlight, that light energy, into sugars and starches. We know what sugars and starches are because we eat those, okay? That's our fuel. Well, the plant very keeps them to themselves because they want to use those stored sugars and starches for reproduction, for growth, and all of their metabolic functions, including their defense systems. So sunlight really does come down to being the most important factor that you provide for your orchid or any plant, really. And if you want to get scientific, there's the formula for the conversion of sunlight into sugars, but we won't talk about that. It's there. You guys know it. All right, come on, baby. There we go. And then if we want to get even more crazy into the science, within the plant's leaf, this is not an orchid leaf, but it's a nice picture of, you can see you can kind of get a feel for some of the structures. There are little organelles, little tiny organs called chloroplasts. And you can see these little green dots in here. And that is actually the spot in the plant cell where this magic of photosynthesis occurs. So there's your science for the moment. Trust me, I will do more. Okay, so meanwhile, back at the ranch, the most important element in the art and science of growing orchids in the home on the windowsill is sunlight. And this is this sunny window in the family room that I was telling you about, where she bloomed that. It's a cattleya hybrid. And they have to vie with window space with the cat, of course, don't we all? All right, so that's light. You've got the picture. Light is the most important thing. Then in today's orchids, when you buy them in the grocery store or in a nursery, you have to deal with the packaging. We didn't used to have to do this, but now we do, because if you notice, this Phalaenopsis, okay, comes in this really pretty cashpo, but there's something wrong with that cashpo. There is no drainage, all right? And we're going to get into the nitty gritties of why drainage is really, really important. But if you don't take that inner pot out, realize that there is no drainage, you're going to end up having a very short-lived orchid. And guys, these plants can outlive us. If we don't kill them, we'll will them to our grandchildren. So you've got a really sturdy plant here, but take it out of the cashpo, put a little round of foil or something that lifts that up. So when you water, you're going to take this to the sink, all right? And you're not going to have that bathtub for the orchid to try to survive in. So deal with the packaging. So number 2 critical element is watering, of course. And I think this is where everybody lacks confidence, all right? I'm going to give you some confidence. So first of all, the pot that your orchid is potted in must have drainage holes in the bottom. And that little, let me back up the train here. This little soft pot actually does have a drain hole in the bottom. This is another type of pot that, again, you'll see it comes in that cashpo, and there are drain holes there. That's why when we talk about watering, this goes to the sink. This stays on the shelf. And after you repot, you'll put them in a pot with drain holes. Very, very important. Okay. So everybody says, oh, I'm so afraid of overwatering. let's talk about what overwatering is. So overwatering is not the volume of water that you apply. It is the frequency with which you apply water. So the rule of thumb for growing any kind of plant, cactus, succulents, orchids, maidenhair ferns, I don't care, is when you water thoroughly and deeply. And I strongly recommend that you do it as the picture is here. This is a Phalaenopsis. I like to use my kitchen sprayer, and I will spend a minute, okay, with that sprayer covering the surface, both sides of that medium for about a minute by the clock. So to water any plant, this is your hanging baskets in the summertime, this is your porch pot, this is your whatever, to water until water comes out the bottom of the pot is not enough, okay? I hear a lot of folks say, well, look, holding a dead plant. Well, I watered once a week until water came out of the bottom, and I go, no, you missed a few important points. You want to water until you get a weight change. And this is one of the reasons why I really like plastic pots. I think plastic pots are a little bit better in helping us deal with our in-home environments, which have a tendency to be a little bit dry. Plastic pots actually slow down the rate of evapotranspiration. So the medium takes a little bit longer to dry out, and that actually suits most plants, assuming they're not sitting in water. So sitting in water is death to most plants, absolutely death to orchids. So meanwhile, back at the ranch, you're at the sink, you're playing the water stream, the diffused water stream around the surface of your medium for about a minute. And I go ahead and I wash the leaves off, and we sing in the shower. No, not really. We have a good time. So then after you've watered it thoroughly, the pot has gone from pot light when it's dry to profoundly heavy. You know you've done a good job. Leave it in the sink for 10, 15 minutes to drain out. So when you do take it back and put it in a pretty cache pot, you're not going to have drips of water accumulating in the bottom. One more caveat on that, take a paper towel and dab out that very, very center, okay? Or sometimes I just blow it out. You don't want any water sitting in the crown of your Phalaenopsis. Now, you're going to say, well, oh, I'm really scared about that. Carol, why do you want to wash off the leaves? Good question. Because one of the issues that we will have in our home is spider mites. All right, they're ubiquitous. They're on every plant that you own. And as long as we keep them down to teeny tiny numbers, we don't have a problem. Well, washing off those leaves hassles them. It doesn't kill them, but it keeps their population numbers so low that they don't become a problem. Plus, I may have dust on my knickknacks, but you don't see dust on my orchids. So it keeps the leaves clean, shiny, healthy, and it does help control your spider mite population. And while you're sitting there watering your orchid, you can give it a look-see for anybody else that you may not want to see on your orchid, like a mealybug. And your stream of water can actually move those mealybugs right on off. So it's a good way of pest control, kind of a proactive pest control. All right, so the next question, so that's how you water, all right? So when do you water? So we love our moms or our aunts or our grandmother, and they told you to water once a week. Don't do that. Don't water once a week or on a time basis for any plant. You have to learn, whether it's a maidenhair fern, a Dieffenbachia, or an orchid, when the medium is the appropriate stage of dryness for that plant. So if it's a succulent, we're talking about, particularly in the winter months, you want that medium to go bone dry all the way through. So with the Phalaenopsis, how do you tell when to water? How do you tell when the medium is drying out? Is sometimes challenging, because in the trade, you can get your Phalaenopsis in this sphagnum moss, and sometimes there's a little algae or moss growing on the top, but you can kind of like poke your finger down in there and see, hey, that's moss all the way down. So it's a golden, long fibered sphagnum moss, or it might be in, this is a straight medium bark, or you might have a medium bark and a peat mix. And all three of those different types of media are going to dry out at a different rate. And this is why you don't want to water on a time basis. It's Saturday, I'm going to water the orchids whether they need it or not, because your medium is going to dry out based on the metabolic activity of your plant, the weather outside. Yes, the weather outside, believe it or not, in our climate controlled homes, the weather outside profoundly impacts your evapotranspiration. So how do you tell? Well, a lot of times, especially in those cache pots, you have a clear pot. So you can see the moisture start to leave over the course of maybe a week to 10 days. In the sphagnum moss, you want to water when the top is absolutely crispy critters, crunchy dry, top. So in a 5 to 6 inch pot, about a ½ inch deep, and it's going to be crunchy dry. I don't mean just losing some of its softness, crunchy, bone dry. In your bark-based mediums, you can see the moisture, the condensation start to leave. You want to water that plant when the medium is dry, okay? When the medium is dry. Now, not dry for 2 weeks, but dry. No more moisture left in there. Why? Because these guys are epiphytes. And in their natural habitat, they go through periods of wet and then dry, wet and then dry. So even though when you think of jungles, you think, oh, you know, humidity and it rains every day or it rains all the time and it's really, really wet. These guys are living out on a branch with their roots stark naked. So they do go to this dry cycle. So your plant needs to be very, very wet and then dry. So when you water, it's going to depend on when the moisture leaves the medium. All right. And I know there's a lot more that could be said about that. Okay. For heaven's sakes, please do not use ice cubes. I don't have time in this talk to tell you about why I know not to use ice cubes. Just take my word for it. I happen to be in Taiwan at a international scientific orchid meeting, all right, of worldwide orchid experts when this concept was introduced. And it's all about marketing and it has nothing to do with good horticulture. So don't ever put a plant on a water diet, not a little shot glass, not or ice cubes. Water, please, the way I just recommended. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about science here. I'm sorry, I'm a plant scientist, so I'm going to talk about science. So this is a diagram of a plant, just a rudimentary anybody's plant. And right here, we've zeroed in on the root structure. And these little blue dots, okay, represent the water that you find in that's next to plant roots, okay? This is not an epiphyte, but we won't go into that right now, what the differences are. So what happens is that you have water present to either the little tiny root hairs on a non-orchid or the velamen, the outside coating of the root, and that absorbs the water. Now there's this cool thing about water molecules. You see, the oxygen is attracted to the hydrogen, but the hydrogens are attracted to hydrogens, so that they're always attracted one molecule to the other. And then they also have this attraction for the sides of the vascular system, all right? And what they end up doing is with this close association, they form this little mass, all right? So let's go up to the leaf. What's happening here? Through the stomata, or the little openings in the leaf, you've got water molecules that are evaporating off. Bye. All right, and as one evaporates off, because of this cohesion factor, adhesion-cohesion factor, the next water molecule gets into the queue to be evaporated off. So what you have is this pull as the water evaporates off the leaf, it pulls the water right on in. So that's why, how water moves through a plant, and maybe it'll help you understand a little bit more about how important water is, and with the orchids, how important that dry off period is. So let's talk about air moisture balance within the medium, because it doesn't really matter what kind of medium you have. And medium, I mean that potting stuff, okay? That's the bark or the bark peat base or the sphagnum moss that you have it in. What you want for your plant roots, your orchid roots, is a mixture of air and water within the medium. Overwatering, if I can get this to go. Overwatering, come on, baby. Computer sometimes doesn't. There we go. Overwatering, I have no more air spaces, and I have the whole medium filled with water, okay? So when you water too often, you don't allow the dry off period, you have saturated medium. Why is that important to you? Why do you even care? Because the cells of the roots metabolize, just like the cells of the leaves do. And we know that the metabolic processes require gas exchange. So you've got carbon dioxide going off, you've got carbon dioxide going in, you've got oxygen moving back and forth. If you have saturated medium, these cells can't metabolize, they die. And when they die, then pathogens have the opportunity to come on in. So this is why watering thoroughly and deeply, but then letting it dry out recharges those air spaces, and that gives your root cells, that makes them nice and strong, and they metabolize the way they should. All right, so enough about watering. Well, I'm sure I'll take questions. The third critical element is repotting. Now, when I started out in orchids a gazillion years ago, I was told, oh my gosh, no, you don't want to repot. You want to leave the medium just the way the grower has it. All right, well, as I got a couple of degrees in plant science, and as I learned a lot more about orchids, I realized that, wait a minute, the grower's medium is going to be formulated for his environment. His greenhouse is nothing like my growing environment. So wait a minute, his medium is not going to be fine-tuned for my situation, okay? So that's the first thing to realize, is that when you buy an orchid, and it doesn't matter really where you buy it, most of them have been grown in a monstrous greenhouse, different environment, and the critical and sad thing is they have been grown to be thrown away. So this, unfortunately, the Phalaenopsis that we see in the stores is a disposable plant. It's just like that chrysanthemum that you buy for a table decoration. It's just like your poinsettia that you buy at Christmas. They're not potted up for their continued good health when you buy it. And the big reason is the medium that's in that pot is formulated for a totally different environment than yours. So where do you go? How do you know what kind of medium to use? We're going to talk about that. All right. The other thing to remember is that this plant has been pushed with excessive amounts of fertilizer in order to get it to grow fast, spike up magnificently. So it's beautiful, and it's a beautiful package that you're going to buy. That's not necessarily the way you want to grow your orchid. All right. You want to grow it slow and steady, not fast and furiously, because we're going for the long haul here. And one of the important things to remember, and this is an important reason to repot, is that orchids are salt sensitive. So what am I talking about? Oops, not you yet. All right, I'm going to skip a slide here. All right, see this discoloration on those roots? That's salt burn. So excessive salts in the medium, like when it comes from the grower, all right, it's been pushed with a lot of fertilizers, that medium is full of salts, it's retarding root growth, and it's burning root trips. And since we're going for the long haul here, we want this plant to develop a good, healthy root mass, and that's where repotting comes in. So you're going to repot to put it in a medium that is appropriate for your environment, not theirs, and you're going to get rid of that salt-infused medium because it's retarding root growth. So where do you go? Oh my gosh, there's so many choices. How do you know what's right for you? Well, you're probably going to have to do a little bit of experimentation. But let me give you some parameters to go by, all right? So you saw me in an earlier slide. I like these hard plastic pots made by Dillon or Cord, except both of those companies got bought out. But anyway, you can find those, At Merrifield, you can find it at most good nurseries. They're a standard plastic pot. That plastic has been UV stabilized. If you're like me and you don't like putting plastic into the waste stream, understand that I've got those pots that I've been using for over a decade. So I sterilize them and I reuse them. Now, you got pretty pots, but the problem with pretty pots, either ceramic or whatever, and that includes this guy down here, all right? The problem with those is, first of all, they're heavy. And I'm telling you to take that pot to the sink. And now you've gotten your collection is up to a dozen pots. And now, I don't know about you, but you know, I'm a horticulturist, longstanding, we get carpal tunnel. So it's heavy. And a lot of times it's not proportioned ideally for root growth. All right. In other words, pretty was the first reagent in the formula. It's the first selection. And slashed pots, you can say, oh, you know, I was told by a friend, I really need slashed pots. Slashed pots, whoop, can't say that, are great for areas of the country that stay wet, where drying is difficult. So think South Florida, where you go for months and nothing dries out, all right? Everything stays wet. Or think about the wet side of Hawaii. That's appropriate, all right? A slashed pot is appropriate for those environments. We live in an environment, we live in a climate-controlled environment that has a tendency to be low humidity and higher drying rate. So this is the ideal pot most of the time for your plants in your environment, okay? So what about this pot? Well, that again is a slashed pot. You can grow it. It is a plastic pot. I don't like the proportions as much, but certainly if you're getting orchids in the store and you've got a collection of these, sterilize them, put them in a 10% Clorox solution for 4 hours. I usually do it overnight, and then they'll be sterile to use for another go around. You could do the same thing for these. The slashed pots are not impossible to grow in. It's just a higher degree of difficulty. Makes it a little harder. So now that we've talked about pots, and there's a lot of different choices, what about growing medium? Okay, so let's talk about what does the medium do? So its first job is to hold the plant up, right? And I've already talked about that air moisture balance. So you want your medium to hold air and hold water. The downside is that all of the different media choices we have are going to retain salts. And again, this plant, take a look at that, those roots, not a brown tip, not a discoloration on it. This plant is healthy. That's a nice healthy root mass. When you get browning on the top like here, this is an indication that you've got concentrated salts within the medium and that plant needs to be repotted, okay? I'm not going to talk an awful lot about water quality, but oh my gosh, that could be another whole talk about water quality. So knowing what water comes out of your tap is sometimes influential in this whole salt buildup thing. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So that's what medium does. So we talked about a little bit about why repotting. Let me talk to you a little bit more about, again, why repot. So when you buy that orchid and it comes from the nursery, the medium is already broken down. So if you know anything about composting, you know that you've got coarse organic matter, and over time, it compacts. So it had lots of air spaces when it was coarse organic matter, but now when it's composted, it's lost its air holding capacity. So over time, the medium in the pot loses its air holding capacity, and you want healthy root cells, okay? So one of the reasons we repot is to reestablish that air moisture balance. I've already talked about the holding of salts, which we know burn orchid roots, kills orchid roots, arrests root growth. Just an aside, okay, so going from orchid growing to plant growing, all plants have varying degrees of salt tolerance. When you think of the junipers out maybe in the sunny spot in front of your house, those guys evolved as a lot of times near the ocean. They can take ocean spray, they can take salts. There are grasses that have a high tolerance of salts. And then you've got all of those plants that maybe if you go carnivorous plants, All right, you have to water with distilled water because they have a low tolerance for salts. So orchids fall into that category of low tolerance for salts, okay? Now, so salts are a real problem. They retard root growth, and that's not the direction we want to go in. Now, if life has been good, the plant is literally crawling out of the pot. A Phalaenopsis orchid is like a slow growing vine, okay? It grows up from the center, and think of it crawling up that tree. So over time, it's crawling out of the pot. So in order to live with me, all right, I have to reorganize its life now and again and put the roots back into the pot. There's a couple of reasons for doing that. It's not critical, but it leaves more of your root surface out there for salts, all right, to damage. So there's reasons for wanting to get those roots within the pot. And the first thing I talked about is the medium in that pot, when you buy it, is formulated for the grower's conditions, not yours. So you want to change it to something that you've learned how to tell when it's wet and how to tell when it's dry. Okay, so how do you choose which medium? You want a balance or an equilibrium between the plant, the environment, and your watering regime, okay? And the most important thing about the medium is that it's the one that you learn what it's like. What does it look like when it's wet? What does it look like when it's dry? One of the other reasons I like plastic pots is because I can tell by pot weight how close I am to that plant thoroughly drying out. So I like to use my tactile feedback fingers. In the clear-sided pots, you can see the moisture change, but in the plastic pots, you can always tell by weight. So when I take that pot to the sink, all right, it's going to be almost fly away light. And that's what I want, because I want that drying before I wet again. After I water in the sink, I'm going to heft that pot again after it's drained out. Is it really, really heavy? Is the difference between before I watered and after I watered, is that a profound difference? Then you know you've watered it enough, okay? So how do you tell when a plant is dry or the pot is dry? Pot weight, tactile feedback, and maybe a visual change. 3 ways to tell that it's time to water. So let's talk about the different components that you might find out there. So fir bark, okay, we like to talk about media in terms of what their plant available water is. So this is getting scientific, sorry about that. But fir bark holds a lot of air, it's easy to dry out, and there is low plant available moisture, okay? Now, the plant's going to adapt to that, and you're going to adapt your watering regime to a fir bark base if that's what you want. Premium New Zealand sphagnum moss is the other medium that you're going to find pretty typically. This should be a long fiber. It should be golden yellow. It shouldn't be brown. It should be golden yellow. And this kind of medium has a high plant available water. So living is really pretty easy, but it doesn't hold air as much. So when we repot with sphagnum moss in the mid-Atlantic states, growing on the windowsill or growing under lights, keep it fluffy, all right? You want air-infused medium. Sphagnum moss is very easy to tell when it's wet and when it's dry because you've got good tactile feedback. You want to water when the top ½ inch for a 5 to 6 inch pot is crunchy, crispy, I really mean it, bone dry. If there's any question in your mind, wait another couple of days. I like it for Phalaenopsis in particular because of the high plant available water if it's not packed like a brick. Now, you're going to get plants from Asia, and you're going to find that the sphagnum moss you could almost pound nails with. All right, it is packed so tight. That works for Taiwan, which a lot of our Phalaenopsis come from there. It does not work for the mid-Atlantic states. So on sphagnum moss, I like the fact that it stimulates root growth. So if I'm reconditioning a damaged plant, that's going to be my go-to. If it's fluffy, it's got the right air moisture balance. And for people who are just starting out and still kind of figuring out what's wet, what's dry, really tells you what dry is. And there's a good difference between the dry weight and the wet weight. So you can really tell that difference in pot weight. All right. So we've talked about the big three: light, water, and repotting. So what else does your orchid need? Well, if you're on Facebook in one of the orchid groups, you're going to get all kinds of crazy stuff. All right. And generally, when you're talking about the main genera, Phalaenopsis, Oncidiums, Cattleyas, and you're talking about hybrids, you don't need some of these other things. Humidity. This is not a make or break factor for those three genera. Feel the leaf on your Phalaenopsis. It's like shoe leather. It has such a thick, waxy layer. It really reduces evapotranspiration. So your humidity is not a critical factor when growing main genera hybrids, which is most of what you guys are growing. Now, if you want to talk about growing Masdevallias and Draculas and all kinds of other species, yeah, we're going to have to get down and add more of those critical factors. But Phalaenopsis, humidity is not it. And I see a lot of newbies starting out just getting so anxious about, oh my God, I don't have enough humidity. That's why my plant died. No, your plant died probably because you didn't understand air moisture balance and you drowned it. Okay. So humidity, generally a no for main genera. So don't bother misting unless you like to exercise your hand. Okay. No pebble trays. Pebble trays are really good for growing fungus gnats, algae, and yuck. So don't use them. And you're not going to need a humidifier for your plants. You may want it for your sinuses, but you don't need it for your plants. Not for main genera orchids, such as I spoke about. Oncidiums, Oncidium intergenerics, Phalaenopsis, and Cattleya hybrids. Now, this is the big one. So we're talking about the mid-Atlantic states, and we have a blessing and a curse living in the mid-Atlantic states. We live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So we have a watershed to protect. Now, I work, my real job, I work for the University of Maryland, and I work in the plant science department. So I work elbow to elbow with the folks that are answering the big burning question in horticulture. How much fertilizer do I need to put on that crop to bring a well-grown plant to the public? And guess what we found out? And this was 10 years ago. Way less than the fertilizer manufacturers would like us to believe. So fertilizer does not feed your plants. You're not feeding your plants. You don't want to over fertilize, because every bit of fertilizer that you put on there that plant doesn't grab right away goes straight down the drain into the Chesapeake Bay, and it's damaging our bay. So we've got the bay to protect, and that means way less fertilizer. I can talk for an hour just on that, so I won't. The other thing that we frequently do is we go to a store or we go online and we go, well, you know, my friend down the street, she uses a 20-20-20, but then I live in the state where they're limiting phosphorus to protect the bay. So maybe I ought to do like a 305. Well, guess what? Your water quality impacts your fertilizer. And if you're going old-fashioned, 10-10-10, any one of those numbers without checking your water quality, first, you could be inadvertently over-fertilizing. And over-fertilizing damages the bay and it wastes your money. I don't like wasting my money. If I'm going to spend money, if I'm going to waste money, I'm going to buy another orchid. Okay, so fertilizer is generally a no. Temperature. I like to say shirt sleeve weather. If you're comfortable in a t-shirt, your orchid is probably going to be comfortable as well. Lots and lots of differences depending on what kind of orchid that you're growing, but pretty much temperature, just room temperature. If you have your orchid near your window, like I want you to get that maximum light, then it's going to feel a day-night temperature differential. And that is in some orchids is one of the bloom triggers. So it's one of the environmental conditions that triggers bloom. So just by having it on a windowsill, you get that day-night temperature differential. So that's a good thing. But pretty much room temperature is fine. Okay, what about the bad guys? We'll talk a little bit about the bad guys, because actually I'm doing really well on time. So I mentioned mealybugs. All right, and that's these fuzzy wuzzy guys here. So when you are having your orchid in the sink and you're having that little let's all shower together moment, all right, turn over those leaves. Look for those little fuzzy wuzzies. Water, a stream of water and a little bit of finger pressure, and they're down the drain. You don't have to use anything else. If you have a major outbreak, then we have to talk about using pesticides. But most of the time, for you, for me, we've got 20, 25 orchids maybe. You can use water and finger pressure for most of these guys. And that goes for scale, these little brown bumps, okay? They're both mealybugs, scale, aphids, and I talk about spider mites. All are sucking insects, they suck. And some of them poop out honeydew, a sticky substance. So you'll see the sticky substance sometimes on the leaves or maybe on the table where you have your orchid. That way, that's an alert. Uh-oh, somebody's sucking on my orchid and I don't want that because they're pooping out that sticky honeydew. That's when you want to give it a really good once over when you're watering to wash off the leaves. Look for anybody that doesn't belong. Aphids are not generally a problem on Phalaenopsis. Sometimes we get them on the inflorescence on Oncidiums. And again, a good strong stream of water and a little bit of finger pressure is all you need. One of the things that you want to do is when you bring a new plant into the household, do not put it with the herd. Keep it quarantined in a different room. Maybe it's the kitchen table. If it's an orchid, you probably purchased it blooming. So yeah, let it sit on the kitchen table or someplace that or your office, now that we're working at home, maybe your office table, so that you can watch it and you can start looking for some of these bad guys or that stickiness, all right? And then your first order of business is going to be using a strong stream of water and a little bit of finger pressure. Now, if you're on Facebook like I am, I use a Q-tip with alcohol. Please don't do that. First of all, alcohol is not a pesticide. You're going to run the risk of burning new foliage, and you don't need to. And a Q-tip is a big fat thing. You want something like maybe a child's paintbrush that you can get down into the little nooks and crannies and check for the babies. So the people who are using the alcohol swabs on the big mamas are totally missing the fact that the first instar, you're not even seeing that. That's why the water stream, finger pressure, you have a much better chance of getting the newly hatched mealybugs, the newly hatched scale, which you won't if you're zeroing in on alcohol and the Q-tip, okay? So running water and mechanical removal, paintbrush for the nooks and crannies, all right? And just finger pressure is you're going to have a better control. And it does keep those spider mites totally hassled, which I love, okay? So what I'm going to do is, Sally, I'm ahead of schedule. Let's take some questions.
Thank you so much, Carol. All right, so for everybody, just a reminder, we're probably going to go over, so just remember if you have to jump off, we are recording, so feel free to email us. So Carol, we've had a few questions come in about light. If you could talk about when you're saying to put the plant in the window, does it need direct sunlight? Should it be in a certain direction facing window, like east, west, north?
Yes. I'm going to get out of screen share. Sally, can you put the Orchid Lady Carol at Gmail in the chat so that they have my point of contact if they should have questions? Let me stop share.
Definitely.
And let me see if I can get my old computer camera to work here. Give me just a second. There we go. Old computer, the camera just like doesn't work all the time. So, all right. And that's a really, really good question. I wanted to cover everything, so I didn't get into the nitty-gritties of directionality. So Phalaenopsis, I like to recommend probably 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 hours of direct morning sun. That's the real McCoy. Remember back to that slide where I talked about the woman that I was working with, where the cat was on the shelf and you saw the sunlight streaming through the window. That's what you want. So 1 to 2, I prefer 2 to 3 hours of direct sun on the Phalaenopsis leaf. And I like morning sun because the morning sun is less intense. Now, if you have a south-facing window, don't worry, you can use that. Or a west-facing window, yeah, you can use that too. The important thing is if you've had your orchid, and I don't care what kind it is, well, main genera. Let's not talk about the Draculas and the Masdevallias and the ones that require special handling. If you've had it in a, I'm going to say a dark corner of your house, and you suddenly put it in that south-facing window, it's going to burn. It's going to burn like I burn. Okay, I go out to garden in April. Whoa, I go out, I play around, and I don't have my sunscreen on. Don't tell my dermatologist. And I'm going to turn lobster pink. However, by July, I'm acclimated. And that's the key term here, acclimation. So if you've had your orchid sitting in the interior of the room with no direct sun, gradually take a couple of weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks, to gradually increase the amount of light on those leaves. And then once they're acclimated, they should be able to take that morning sun. Particularly, I really like that for phales because you can't get into trouble as much. South face, we have this little thing called an equinox where suddenly the angle and the intensity of the sun can get super bright. 2 weeks ago, it was fine. 2 weeks from now, it's going to be fine. But that moment on a south-facing window, and you have to kind of know that part of your environment. You can burn anything when we go through the equinox. Did that help? Oh, let me throw in a couple other genera. So if you've got that south or that west-facing window, and you're ready to move on to something more exciting, all right? Oncidium intergenerics, I liken them to the daylilies of the orchid world. They are extremely vigorous. The selection of colors and shapes and fragrance, I love fragrance in my orchids. They're like little weeds, I love them. And they're gonna want a little bit more sun. So I like to say about 3 to 4 hours of direct sun on the leaves as a minimum. I'm giving you minimums, okay? Your Phalaenopsis can grow fine in that south-facing window, acclimated to the light, careful of the equinox, all right? The more sun, the more vigorous the growth. It's kind of just a rule of thumb. Your Cattleyas are probably going to want that full south or west-facing window, good 5 to 6 hours of sun on the leaves. Just watch the equinox, you can burn, okay? So that gives you some guidelines, all right, on directionality, light intensity, numbers of hours. When I talk about artificial lighting, because I see you guys putting things in the chat, I know what you're doing. All right, when you're working under artificial light, and I strongly recommend LEDs, and the reason I like LEDs is because their conversion from the kilowatt hours that you buy to light intensity that strikes on photosynthetically active radiation, PAR, all right? There are very few light fixtures out there that are going to give you PAR, but that's the light that plants use, not lumens, not lux, not foot candles. That's talking about, all right, human perception. Plants don't perceive the same light levels. So you want photosynthetically active radiation, and your LEDs seem to, by default, are pretty high in PAR. So you're going to want to run your lights no more than 12 to 14 hours because plants need their beauty sleep. So what I like to say, but it actually goes back to photosynthesis, so don't start me on that, all right? So I do like LEDs, and I have used LED shop lights that I can get from Costco that have absolutely nothing on them that say plant, but I have a PAR meter, okay? I have a quantum meter, and I can measure photosynthetically active radiation. And that's maybe not where you guys want to go if you're just starting out because it's $300. But we can talk more about artificial light another time.
Thanks, Carol. Just really quickly, sorry about this. I was trying to pull up your email address and I'm having some trouble. Can you tell the group what it is?
Orchid Lady Carol at gmail.com.
Perfect, at gmail.com. All right, sorry, everybody.
And no E on the end of Carol, C-A-R-O-L. And no spaces, no punctuation.
Perfect, thank you so much.
I'm ready for another question.
All right, yeah, we've got plenty more questions coming in.
Oh my gosh, I can see the chat.
I know you can see it. All right, so we have a couple of questions about people who've gotten the sticky spots on their leaves. So they've checked and they aren't there's a couple of people who've asked actually very similar questions. So they've checked, they can't find anything. So what do you recommend in those cases?
Okay, so what they're probably seeing is a phenomenon called guttation. No, there's your new word for the week. So guttation is when you get an environmental, I'm going to call it an imbalance, but that's not quite the right term, between the moisture level in the medium and the evapotranspiration rate and the water moving through the plant. And what happens is the plant pushes excess sugars to the edges of the leaves, and sometimes on flower buds, you might see it, and it's just sugar. Now, make sure, I really recommend get a magnifying lens or you get a loop, and I usually have a loop within an arm's reach. So a jeweler's loop, and that way you can really get close and you can see what's going on, and use that jeweler's loop to make sure that you don't have like those immature scale or immature mealybugs, which are really, really hard to see, okay? But guttation is a natural process. Don't worry about it. Wash it off, okay? And just give a good inspection. Also, keep in mind, if you've got your orchids with other house plants, you could have a typhoid Mary, all right? You could have a Dieffenbachia or Spathiphyllum or somebody else that has that sap-sucking insect on it. And I have to tell you that those insects don't just like poop, they projectile poop. So the honeydew goes boom, and you're going to find it sometimes not where the insect is exactly.
Things I didn't know.
Projectile poop.
Good to know. All right, so we have a couple people asking now about caring for the blooms once they're spent. At what point do you remove the stalks? Is there any other tips you have for people about making sure you're caring for them?
You know, if I were really smart, I would have anticipated that, because in the kitchen, I have a Phalaenopsis coming out of bloom. I have a couple that are coming out of bloom. They're waiting for me to get around to repotting them. So it depends. Don't you hate that? It depends. So it's February. Our main genera of Phalaenopsis, our main breeding lines of Phalaenopsis. Let me get my thoughts put together here. So that's going to be your pink, your white with pink lip, your pink stripes, even into your harlequins with the big spots on them. Okay, so they're normal bloom time if they haven't been fooled into blooming out of sync with their normal life cycle. This is main bloom time. You know, if you've got a collection of Phalaenopsis, you're swimming in blooms right now. So you're going to allow that bloom period, and it'll go from maybe December to maybe May, and Phalaenopsis bloom from the back to the front on the spike, all right? When the last couple of blooms start to fade, you can do one of two things, all right? A lot of times I will break the inflorescence where that first flower came out, all right? And if your plant is old enough, it's the right season, etc., you will get a side shoot, all right, from that main spike. And if it's a good, healthy plant, I'll let it give me one set of blooms and a second set of blooms. And at that point, if it's a new plant, if it's a young plant, I cut off the spike right down where it joins the leaf, because I'm telling that plant, okay, honey, you've really bloomed well for me, but now I want you to take all of your resources and I want you to make new roots and new leaves. All right, I want you to get on with life and get strong. Okay, once you get a little bit of confidence under your belt, you're going to say, okay, that's a nice set of blooms. I mean, it just bloomed for 6 months. I don't need to ask more of it. Now I want that plant to grow. Now, if you got a fully in bloom Phalaenopsis last October, and it's a pink or a pink stripe or white with pink lip, it's been forced to bloom out of season. So I still like to use my one set of flowers, two set of flowers, cut spike, because I want that plant to grow up to be a big plant. All right, that's roughly it. Now, if it's a yellow and it's got yellow breeding influence, you can tell because the inflorescence is a zigzaggy stem, or it's a Violacea or Bellina type, little short stems and purple flowers with great scent, you never cut those spikes. So yellow, purple, sometimes a red, you never cut the spikes. And then if you were emailing me, I'd say, send me a picture of the plant and I'll tell you what you need to do. Okay. There's a lot more to say about that, but that'll give you some guidelines. All right.
Thanks.
Anything else?
Yes, a few questions about roots. The first question is, what do you do if you've allowed your plant to dry out so much that you're concerned for its health? Um, do,
Don't do it again.
yeah,
Okay.
do you give it, she asked, she said, I gave it a good soak, but I feel that it still needs water. Do I need to water it more often while it's recovering, or what do I do?
No, I'm going to say you go back in the slide deck and you look at those little white dots and those little blue dots. All right. So even though you've not been the best plant mommy in the world, and hey, I've killed more orchids than you have. All right. So don't worry about it. It's a learning experience sometimes. I would, once you've watered it thoroughly, and maybe you've let a week or two go by, I would open it up and I would see what's happening with those roots. We kill more orchid roots from too much water than not enough water. I'll tell a little story. So I'm kind of well known in the DC area for orchids, and a lot of times people will come to me for greenhouse advice, et cetera, et cetera. I was approached quite a few years ago by some folks whose father had died. He passed away, and he had a greenhouse full of orchids, and the estate was complicated, and you know how things like that can go. So, you feel sorry that you've lost another orchid grower in the world, but he had a greenhouse full of orchids, 6 months with no water. Yeah, there were a lot of dead plants, but what was really amazing is there was a good number of live plants. Now they needed a little TLC, but that's what we did. I sat down with some of the heirs that were interested in carrying on their father's collection, and we soaked them really good. And I talked about proper watering. All right, not every 6 months, please. And we repotted and we got them going, and those orchids are still going on. So don't do it, but it's not the end of the world. If your orchid leaves are wilted, more than likely you have rotted off the roots. It's not a matter of not enough water. It's been a matter of too much water, or that cash pot being full of water. That's death to orchid roots.
Got it. So what do you do if the orchid roots are damaged, if they've browned either from salt or if they've wilted or rotted? What do you do with them then?
All right. So my master's degree research was in orchid virus transfer. So if you want to know about orchid virus, I can give you all the gross nitty gritties. So one of the things that I avoid like the plague is cutting. Yeah, I know. That's the first thing you do is you get scissors out. No, slap your hand. So I work with gloves, and I'll wear one pair of gloves per plant. And I frequently I've cleaned the surface I'm working on because I don't want to transfer orchid virus. So that's our big bugaboo. We can't cure it, so we have to prevent it. So what I do is when I have orchid roots, I feel them. And the outer coating is called velamen, and it is a type of plant cell with a huge vacuole. All right, a vacuole is a big like storage container in a cell. And these cells are all vacuole, and they have evolved to pick up moisture within 30 to 60 seconds of their being moistened. They now are full of water. And then inside, all right, you've got that shiny, hopefully it's a silvery green. And if you wet it, it turns green. Or maybe if it's down in the medium, it might be an ivory color, right? But it's going to be solid, right? It's not going to be soft and flaccid. All right, so that's the outer coating of velamen. So when I undress my orchid, all right, I've taken all the medium off, I go root by root, and I feel for soft or flaccid areas. And sometimes in an orchid root, you'll have a damaged part, maybe up, I call it by the shoulders, all right? In that picture, that's where most of the salt damage was. Maybe that's all dry, all right? But I just kind of peel that off with my fingers, because maybe the next section of root, which is down in the medium, is solid. Now, it can be brown, it can be ivory, it can be any color, but if it's solid, leave it. So that's why I say, don't you get out those scissors, because when you saw that first part of the root, what were you going to do? You were going to cut it off. No, you probably still have a viable root down towards as you go down the root away from the plant. And then the very tip, maybe where it was in the bottom of the pot, where it stayed wet, that's all mush. So I just peel that off. And I go root by root by root until I establish what is my viable root mass. And when I repot, I choose my pot so that it fits the root mass. All right. Because it's going to spend the rest of its life cycle in the next year growing out of that pot. So no grow room when you repot. They like to be cozy. I liken it to swaddling a baby. Okay. So no grow room because they're not terrestrial plants. They have a different growing habit. Now that's Phalaenopsis. That's not Oncidiums or Cattleyas, but that's Phalaenopsis. All right, that was a lot.
All right, so I just want to tell everybody, because I'm seeing more and more questions come in, which is fantastic. I'm trying, so for those of you all who have really specific questions to your own plants, what I'm trying to do for Carol is give her questions that I'm seeing a lot of people asking. So if we have time to get to the specific questions, we will, but otherwise, please feel free to contact us after. So next,
and let me tell you, if I get 50 emails, it might take me a while to work through them. So be patient.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we're getting a lot of questions about the type of water, if a water softener would have water that would damage the plant, if distilled water is better, stuff like that.
Oh, water quality. It's actually what I do in my real job at the University of Maryland. I deal a lot with water quality. So if you're finding that, all right, first of all, you notice that I preferred top-down watering. If you have been watering your orchid by putting it in a bowl of water, what happens is that all of the salts and minerals in your water are now concentrated up where those root shoulders are. And that's also where your new roots are going to come out. So you're just nipping those little babies in the bud by concentrating your salts up at the top. So water from the top down. Okay, that's the first thing. If you've got salt damaged roots, repot. All right. You may find that with your Phalaenopsis that you have to repot, or it's better for your root growth to repot every 6 months. They love it. There's no problem. All right. If you've heard, oh my God, I can't repot my orchid because, I might damage it. Listen to the orchid. All right. They actually dropping that salt level usually spurs them into a flush of new growth, which I love to see. New roots, new leaves. Hey, it makes my heart beat faster. So, and now I've lost track. What was the question?
Distilled and soft water.
Water. Okay, water quality. So the quickest way is to probably get a water test. And you're going to want to not go to your health department. Oh, there goes my old camera again. Not go to your health department, but you're probably going to want to go to Peters up in Pennsylvania. There's a bunch of horticulture testing labs, and it may cost you about $30, but you're going to get a water analysis, and that's going to tell you what your total dissolved salts. All right. On the flip side, you can buy a good TDS meter, total dissolved salt meter, and you can see what your water is. But if you're on municipal water, generally your water quality is going to be consistent, pretty consistent. You can also get a report from your municipality. I've never done that on the mineral basis of my water, so I don't know if you're going to get the right information. But definitely a horticulture testing lab will definitely give you what your water quality is. Now, if you don't want to go to all that work, and I don't blame you, what you can do, but you see the salt burn on your plants, even after repotting or new roots start to get salt burn, you know you've got an issue. You can use a Brita filter, but please remember to change the filter, because if you don't change the filter in the Brita filter, it loses its filtration real fast. So you can use a charcoal based and see if that helps. You can water with distilled water occasionally, all right? Because Carol's saying don't fertilize, your plant's getting a lot of its minerals from your water, all right? So if we go to 0 minerals, then we have to talk about using a special fertilizer that is formulated to be used with distilled water. Now we get really, really into the weeds on water quality, and you probably don't want to work that hard. So the occasional flush of distilled water, repot maybe every 6 months, is going to help manage the salt balance or the salts.
That's great.
That was a lot. I'm sorry.
It's all really good information. I'm learning a lot personally. All right, so we've had a lot of people ask, and I'll give one specific example. This woman's son gave her a Phalaenopsis orchid, and it took her about 2 years to get it to rebloom. So she would like to know if it's possible what she can do to get it to rebloom, maybe more than every 2 years.
Okay. I love it when people give me orchids. They may come in a florist glass cube, which is death to orchids. And I thank them. I go, oh, thank you so much. And then as soon as they're gone, bye, I take it out of the glass cube because that's death to orchids. So when you get a gift orchid, a lot of times florists will put moss all the way up around it. Pull that around. That crown needs good air circulation. Where the leaves come out and the roots come out, you want that air circulation. You don't want medium up to here. You don't want decorative moss up to here. Pull that away. Check to make sure you've got good drainage. All right. And yes, I am answering your question because gift orchids can, florists, if there's any florists in the crowd, forgive me. Florists look at an orchid plant as a bouquet with leaves. And if they can get it to look good for a week or two, they've done their job. All right. We want it to grow and bloom years from now. We want to give it to our kids. All right. So make sure that the presentation is such that you've got that good drainage. And then you're going to have to identify the orchid. Oops. Yeah, there's a whole bunch out there. And sometimes that's a little difficult. You can always send me a picture, but oh my God, I'm going to be inundated with emails, I know. But let's assume it's a Phalaenopsis. So you've received it in bloom. You want to check and see what kind of medium it's in. So remember I said you're going to water differently for an all bark or a bark peat mix or a sphagnum. So now you're going to do a little exploratory. You're going to kind of get down there and see what's there. You're going to look through the sides of the clear pot to see that, how is this going to dry? How can I tell when it's dry? And then you're going to let it dry. Sometimes you'll get a floral arrangement with a maidenhair fern and an orchid. Wow, you couldn't ask for more different plants if you worked at it. All right. So a lot of times on those floral arrangements, I will separate them immediately because the maidenhair fern is going to need totally different environmental conditions than the orchid. Now, sometimes I see floral arrangements where you've got the orchid and a succulent. Now you're talking, because both of those guys want to dry between waterings. So the important thing on getting your orchid to rebloom is water it correctly, get it in the correct amount of sun, get it out of a container that is not going to drain for you. So just what I said, light, water, repot, 3, okay? Those 3 things, and my camera's gone again. There we go.
That's fine. Is there a certain time of year for people who want to repot their orchids or feel that they need to? Is there a certain time of year or time before or after blooming that needs to be done?
Okay, so I have a lot of folks that say, oh, I can't repot because it's in bloom. You have to know that before COVID, I ran a diagnostic and repotting clinic several times a month. So I see about between 800 and 1,000 orchids a year grown by a lot of people, just folks, just lots of folks. So that's why I have developed my particular formula, the light, the watering, and the repotting. I will repot if I have to save mom. If someone brings me an orchid and it's been sitting in a cash pro and it's like swimming and it's got a spike on it, I'll break spike. If I think that I can get that, if I can coach the person into bringing that mom plant back into good health, I will break spike and I will repot immediately. If I'm working with someone who's got the idea of the sunlight, the proper watering, etc., we'll hold off repotting until that first bloom is done. All right. So I will repot a phale up until the buds get bigger than an English pea, or the very end of my little finger. So when you've got that orchid, the first set of blooms is fading. It's starting to make a side shoot. I'll get in and I'll repot right there. All right. unless the buds are bigger. But then I'm going to look at the root mass and I'm going to make that decision of, if I disturb those roots and it's got bigger buds, you know, if the roots are in bad shape, I'm going to intervene. I'm going to do an intervention. When I work with sphagnum moss, when I go to sphagnum moss, because if it's got a reasonable root mass at all, because of the high plant available moisture, I rarely get bud drop with repotting. Okay. But that's a sphagnum specific thing. If you like bark, don't repot. Don't repot until the inflorescence is done. If you have to do a rescue, you're going to have to learn how to use sphagnum moss, because that's going to stimulate your best root growth. So I use both mediums depending on the condition of the plant, and I will intervene if I have to save the plant, if the root mass is so damaged. That probably didn't answer your question as well as you wanted.
That all makes sense. So here's our next question. If you have a couple of people have written in, so they're concerned that their planting medium isn't drying out fast enough, like it's holding water too long. Do you have any recommendations? Should they change the pot? Should they look at changing the medium?
Yeah.
What should they do?
Yeah. Well, so what's too long? Now, if I have a big fail, all right, and guys, you know, these things get like 2-foot leaf spans, and they'll carry multiple spikes, but they need some age on them, all right? So now you're looking at, depending on the hybrid, year 5, 7, 8. I used to have a woman bring in a 15-year-old Phalaenopsis every year for me to repot, and it carried 6 to 7 spikes. We had to go through spike management. I was cutting spikes and she was going, oh, are you sure you have to? And I'm like, come on now, you've had this orchid for 15 years. You know it's going to make more spikes. It needs to take a break. Okay. So what was my question? Because I distracted myself.
About the potting medium, dry.
Potting medium. Okay, sorry.
Sitting in wet medium too long.
Big pot. See, I got thinking about that because I saw there was someone asking about how do I multiple spike. So I was like, oh, they want that question answered. So if I've got a big, like an 8-inch pot, and I've got this 2-foot leaf span, that 8-inch pot is going to take 2 to 2.5 weeks to dry out, and that's okay. Now, if it's a small plant, and again, the question is, so what's too long? It can take 10 days to 2 weeks. If you're going to default one way or the other, always default to dry, because another thing, oh God, more science, I'm sorry, here's more science. These guys have the same metabolism as a cactus. It's called crassulacean acid metabolism. They are a drought adapted plant. So when I compare that maidenhair fern that needs to be watered like every other day to an orchid, this guy is drought tolerant. The fern is not going to fare very well in my house. All right. So let it go dry. And if it takes 2 weeks, maybe that's your medium combination. Make sure there's good drainage. Make sure it's got enough sun. Change the medium if you don't like to go 2 weeks. If 2 weeks makes you nervous, maybe you want a more bark-based medium that's going to dry out quicker. But it can take 2 weeks to dry out, and that's okay because it's a drought-adapted plant.
That makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so what should you do if you have, I think this is probably 2 questions in one. So when you're repotting, should you repot to a certain, is there like a size pot that you need to expand to? Is there some rule for that? That's probably the first question. No?
Okay, you're going to undress your orchid, take all the medium off. And you're going to go through that. Is it flaccid? Is it smushy? Is it firm? Is it smack? You know, you're going to go through each and every root, and you're going to pull off the slimy or the dry parts, not the whole root. When you're through, you're going to have a root mass. Chances are, if you're early in your learning curve, it's going to be a smaller root mass than it started out with. I'm sorry, just learn from it, okay? I am going to take that root mass and I'm going to fit it to a pot, no grow room. I'm going to fit it to a pot. So when I repot, whether I do it for somebody else or I do it for me, I've got 6 different sizes, graduated sizes in front of me. And it's like trying on shoes. Once I clean up that root mass, what size pot is it going to fit into? So you're not increasing size of plant pot. Like if someone were to give you recommendations on repotting a geranium, well, okay, you're going to, put it in an inch larger pot. No, you don't do that with orchids because we're stripping all the medium off and we're analyzing the root mass. Now, you get to pat yourself on the back when year 2 comes around and you've got roots crawling all over like a Medusa, and you take a bow, make a mimosa, you repot, and then it's going to go into a larger plant, a larger pot size, and that's success, guys. That's success. Now, hand in glove with that, if you make that good root mass, chances are you've got flowers and you've got lots of them. All right. So I will equate progress by root mass increase. There's another little aside there too. You notice how Phalaenopsis have kind of ranks of leaves, all right? And the bottom ones should be nice and big, and then the next ones should also be nice and big. And if you've had that plant for a while, that next set of leaves that you put on should be equal to or greater than the previous set of leaves. If you're growing your Phalaenopsis for several years and the leaves are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, even if it's blooming, go back to your culture. You've missed a step. That plant's not growing. It's kind of like spinning its tires, okay? So you want your leaves, each set of leaves that you put on, and normally they're going to make a new set of leaves like July, August, September, kind of, depending on the breeding line, all right? You want those leaves to be as big or bigger than the set before. And that's another pat yourself on the back. It's like that big root mass, pat yourself on the back. The bigger leaves, pat yourself on the back, because it's going to end up being more flowers. I know that's what you're after. I'm after the bigger leaves and the bigger roots.
We just had a question come in that relates to that. So what happens if you're a beginner and when you go to evaluate your roots, almost all of them are gone?
Watch this video again.
All right.
Light, proper watering, and repotting. All right. And I imagine, especially the repotting concept, that's going to be new to most of you guys, because somewhere in your mind, you're either afraid, these plants are tough. They really, really are tough. All right. You're going to be afraid to change out the medium. Sometimes you have to buy a whole bunch of stuff to be ready for whatever is going to happen with your orchid when you open it up. All right. Different pot sizes. Carol wants me to have different pot sizes. Do I do bark? Do I do sphagnum moss? There's can be angst with this, all right? So generally, as my rule of thumb, if you come to my clinics, and once we get beyond warm weather, I'll have clinics held outside again, you'll see me take a pitiful orchid down to its last 2 roots, and I will put it in a little tiny pot with sphagnum moss. So sphagnum moss has a couple of advantages in the fact that it stimulates root growth. It's got that high plant available moisture, so living's a little easy for the plant. It's not quite as tough, all right? And I will pot it down in size. And I like the sphagnum because if the plant has lost most of its roots, I need to work with the owner on watering technique and interval, okay? And sphagnum is really easy to tell when it's time to water again. With sphagnum moss, you become a plant slave, but that's okay. They give you flowers.
Carol, we have a few people asking before we move on to our next orchid related question. Where do you hold your clinics and how can they stay in touch with you if they want to come to a clinic?
Email me.
All right.
And I am Orchid Lady Carol on Facebook.
All right.
So you can follow me on Facebook, Orchid Lady Carol. With COVID, I haven't been putting up an awful lot of postings. When we get back to warm weather, I let people know where I'm repotting. You already have the Orchid Lady Carol at Gmail account. So, you can always shoot me a question that way.
That sounds good. Thank you. I know we had a few people asking that just now. So, all right. So we've got about 10 minutes left. Carol, what do you recommend if someone has the stalk of flowers is growing, but the blooms are falling off, the buds are falling off before they actually can bloom?
Okay, so actually that's a really, really good question. There's so many things I could talk about. So bud blast. A lot of times it's because the roots got saturated. All right. So I would say, look to the roots, what's going on there. If they've rotted off, then yeah, that plant is it's hunkering down. All right. Most of the time, the plant will keep the flowers on because for them, it's a reproductive structure, and reproduction trumps everything, including plant defense and plant growth. So more than likely, they'll hold the flowers. But there's a couple of times when you'll get bud drop. Mangling the roots, mistreating the roots is one of them. But there's two other ones. Presence of ethylene gas. Well, where do we get ethylene gas? Ripening apples and bananas. So if you've got this lovely still life on your kitchen counter of ripening fruit in your Phalaenopsis orchids, yeah, those fruit are giving off ethylene gas and you're going to get bud drop. All right, that's one way. Also, ethylene gas can be a byproduct of poor combustion in a gas or oil furnace. And that actually happened to me, where I had a mother-daughter combination, lived in an old house in Laurel, and we had bud blast. And I'm like, I've everything. I checked out everything. And I said, have your furnace serviced. And they were getting ethylene gas byproduct because of poor combustion. So I probably saved their lives. I don't think so. It was a leaky old house. I live in a leaky old house too. It's hard for us to die of carbon monoxide poisoning if the windows leak. Anyway, so those are the presence of ethylene gas and mistreated roots. And I've had shipments of orchids come up from Florida in a truck with mixed tropical plants, which is doom. Every bud, every stalk dropped every plant, every bud. Every stalk dropped every bud on every orchid in that shipment because of the enclosed space and the ethylene gas. Needless to say, I wasn't happy.
I can imagine not. Wow.
No,
I didn't
no.
Don't place your orchids next to your fruit bowls.
Nope. That's right.
Good to know. All right. So we have a few questions coming in. So they're basically asking like two questions here. One is, at what point do you need to provide your orchid with some help because it's so tall? And then another question, someone visited the Biltmore. We've had a few questions about how they have these beautiful large orchids. They're not even necessarily in pots. Like, how do they get these orchids to be so beautiful and large?
Okay, so I'm going to take the second question first.
Yeah.
So you'll see pictures on Facebook of orchids grown in Taiwan. And let me tell you, they're native there. So it's the ideal environment. So yeah, they have a little bit better conditions than we do. All right. So we're faking it and we're trying to pinch it and make these plants happy so that they'll bloom. There are actual techniques for multi-spiking and making those big multi-stemmed cascades of flowers. And that's another whole talk. And it's not easy to do. You'll see that on Facebook because what you don't see are the 50 orchids still in the greenhouse that didn't work. That technique didn't work for those orchids. You and I would be so happy with them because maybe the spike is it's not quite even. It's called shingling. Maybe it doesn't shingle quite perfectly. So yeah, they have a lot of orchids and they have the perfect environment and there are techniques to do that. So remind me of what the first question was.
At what point, so assuming you're able to grow this beautiful tall orchid, at what point do you need to provide it with some support?
Okay, so if you've got like a big white, those 4 to 5 inch flowers, big leaves, a lot of times you get a really, really tall spike on those. And you're going to have to start staking that, supporting it from the beginning. And what I do is when that little spike comes out, it's very, very fragile. Do not use your hair clips on those. I take a twisty tie and I twist it around the stake first. I twist it and then I've got 2 pieces that come around and I make an opening for the spike to go through. So you don't want to constrict that or you'll kill it. All right. But I'll start right at when it's this big. If it's already gotten woody and hard, go with it because you're not going to straighten that out. You're going to snap it and you'll be unhappy. I've turned many rooms air blue from breaking a spike when I didn't want to. So, start soft and give them those loops to go through. When it's hardened, then you can use your hair clips.
That sounds good. Okay, so a couple of watering questions, I think based on some things that we commonly hear about, especially people like me who aren't anything even remotely like an orchid expert. So a lot of people have heard about putting the ice cubes in the orchids. One person talks about how they submerge their orchids for 15 to 30 minutes.
Why? You're working too hard. Don't work hard. Okay, ice cubes. So I told you earlier that I was in Taiwan when the just use ice cube procedure method was announced. And know that it's not good horticulture, it's really good marketing. So one of the ways that the plant will drop flowers is if the roots get saturated. And I just covered that a few minutes ago when I said, if you mishandle the roots, they'll bud drop. All right. So the growers of Phalaenopsis orchids want you to have a good experience because they figure you're going to have that orchid plant for about 2 weeks and then you're going to throw it away and you're going to go buy the next one. Okay. So when we get a plant, we want to love it to death. And the way most people worldwide love things to death is they're watering it all the time, watering it all the time. But with an orchid, remember, that crassulacean acid metabolism, it's a drought adapted plant, you're going to cause bud drop. And then you're not going to have a happy time with orchids. You're going to say, oh, I can't grow them. I'm not going to buy another one. All right. No. So if you restrict the amount of water, the volume of water, the plant will maintain the flower stalk because you're keeping it drought stressed by underwatering it. But horticulturally, that's not the way to grow a good orchid. And if we're going for the long haul, then you don't want to give it a restricted diet of water. Okay, so that's what ice cubes do. Plus, they're 32 degrees on a plant that doesn't know below 60 degrees. That's the minimum temperature for a Phalaenopsis orchid to live in is 60 degrees. And you just put 32 degrees on its roots. Not a good idea. So it's restricting water, it's putting it on a water diet, not a good idea, and it's darn cold. And I really want you to learn how to do it right. Can I say? All right, next question.
All right, let's see. I think we have time for about one more. Can you talk a little bit about the light? We have different people are sending in saying, oh, I grow my orchid in an east facing window. I put mine right in the window. I took mine outside and the leaves burned.
Yeah. Remember, I burn, acclamation.
Can you talk a little bit about proper lighting for orchids so that people know where to place it, if they want to put it outside, if they should put it outside, that kind of thing?
Okay, so east facing window, 2 to 3 hours of direct sun. That's sun on the leaves, not just bright light, sun on the leaves. All right, the real McCoy. When you go from a low light situation with any plant, I don't care what it is, Dieffenbachia, orchid, anything, all right, you have to acclimate it to the higher light level. So, oh God, I remember one lady who I see on a regular basis, the painters were coming to paint her kitchen and family room where she kept the orchids. So it was April and, you know, the sun's not real bright and heavy, and she put all the orchids out on the deck, fried them. So you can't make up for low light by suddenly giving them small periods of bright light. So outside, without going through an acclimation process, you're going to end up damaging leaves. And one of the important things rarely spoken about to know about Phalaenopsis is that they're only going to give you max 2 new leaves per year. I could cut off every leaf off of a Phalaenopsis. It's not like a pansy. It's not going to suddenly spring forth with tons of new growth. It's going to give you 2 leaves per year. That's the downside, which means that every bit of leaf surface is precious, all right? So remember, acclimate if you're going from low light to high light. 2 to 3 hours of direct sun is great. You've got a south-facing window. and you're a little nervous about, Carol said something about the equinox, put a sheer curtain, but you really want light on the leaves, all right? Some good direct sun, even if it's diffused through a sheer curtain. Did that answer the question? I hope.
I believe so.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
good.
Yeah. All right, we're at 1:30, so I want to go ahead and just let you know. For those of you, we just had so many questions come in. We have even more than we had when we started the Q&A session.
Yeah.
Lots of engagement. So thank you so much to all of you, Carol. Thank you so much. Just want to reiterate, feel free to email Carol. You can email me. I have Carol's email.
Yep.
She may get a lot of questions, so just
No, I
have some
bet.
patience. But Carol, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to address before we go ahead and sign off for the day?
Thank you all for coming, and thanks for growing orchids, because they're the most beautiful plants in the world.
Thank you so much, Carol. Just want to say thank you again to everybody coming out. Send
Yes.
me an email if you want the recording. You guys all have Carol's email address. Thank you so much. And everybody have a good day. We'll go ahead and conclude the
All right.
webinar now. Thank you.
All right,
Bye,
take
Carol.
care.
Bye.
Bye.